The morning sun broke through hazy clouds, casting long, ghostly shadows over the ruined city as Mason, Riley, and Carter prepared to continue their journey south. They hadn't slept much, but in a world teetering on the edge of chaos, rest was a luxury. Carter had managed to scavenge an old van that miraculously started up with a few kicks and some whispered pleas, though it sputtered like an animal on its last legs. Still, it was their ticket out of the city, a step closer to their hopes of finding a safe haven. The air inside the van was thick, tense with an unspoken mistrust between Carter and the other two. He sat in the driver's seat, fingers drumming on the wheel, eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if he were being hunted. Mason sat next to him, his body angled defensively, and Riley was in the back seat, her gaze shifting nervously between the two men. Carter cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had filled the van since they'd started. "Just so we're clear, I'm not doing this out of charity. We're only working together as long as it benefits me." Mason nodded, eyes narrowed. "Understood. But if you put us in danger, we're not sticking around." Carter smirked but didn't reply. Instead, he kept his focus on the crumbling road ahead, carefully steering around potholes and debris that littered their path. The landscape had become an eerie wasteland. Skyscrapers leaned like tired giants, their windows shattered and walls cracked. Rusted-out cars sat abandoned in the streets, frozen remnants of lives left behind in panic. As they drove, Riley broke the silence, leaning forward with curiosity. "Carter, where are you from? I mean, before all of this?" He didn't answer right away, his jaw clenching. "Nowhere worth mentioning," he finally muttered. "Guess you could say I'm used to living on the edge, even before the world fell apart." Riley glanced at Mason, who gave a slight nod, indicating she should let it go. But the van soon hit an unexpected obstacle. A wrecked bus sprawled across the road, its faded school yellow paint streaked with dirt and dust. Carter cursed under his breath, slowing the van as he peered around. "Gonna have to go around it. Sit tight." As he maneuvered onto a narrow side street, Mason's eyes caught a movement in the rearview mirror, a faint, ghostly shape darting between the abandoned vehicles behind them. "Carter, do you see that?" Mason's voice was barely a whisper. Carter glanced back, frowning. "What did you see?" "Something's following us." Riley's grip tightened on the seat, her heart racing. They exchanged wary glances as Carter accelerated, their eyes glued to the mirrors. But the street seemed empty again, just rows of decaying buildings watching them pass by. "Probably just nerves getting to you," Carter said dismissively, though his foot pressed down a little harder on the gas pedal. "We're almost out of the city limits." They didn't dare breathe a sigh of relief, but the emptiness around them was oddly comforting after the claustrophobic streets of Chicago. Open roads stretched ahead, though the pavement was cracked, weeds pushing up through the concrete. The once bustling highways had become hauntingly silent. As they picked up speed, the van's radio crackled unexpectedly. Static filled the van, followed by faint murmurs, fragments of voices lost in the airwaves. Mason leaned forward, twisting the dial to catch the signal, hoping it was a survivor's broadcast. "Aid, all clear, danger on the voice was barely discernible." "What's that?" Riley asked, a flicker of hope in her voice. Carter scowled. "Waste of time. Most broadcasts are traps. People lure you in, then take everything you got." "But what if it's real?" Mason pressed. "We should at least try to pick it up." Carter shook his head, slapping the dial to silence. "I don't trust anything that sounds too good to be true." He continued down the desolate highway, the tension in the van thickening once more. They hadn't gone much farther when Carter suddenly slammed on the brakes, throwing everyone forward in their seats. A blockade loomed ahead, rows of sandbags, overturned cars, and metal barricades stretched across the road, forming an impassable barrier. "Damn it," Carter muttered. "Looks like someone doesn't want company." The three climbed out of the van, taking in the blockade. Scattered bones and bloodstains painted a grim picture. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't ended well for those who tried to pass through. "Maybe we can go around," Riley suggested, scanning the area. "Or maybe we turn back," Carter replied, already heading toward the van. "No," Mason said firmly. "This is the only road south. We'll have to clear a path." They got to work, cautiously moving pieces of debris while keeping an eye on their surroundings. The uneasy silence felt like a warning, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the air, sending chills down their spines. They froze, their eyes darting in every direction, searching for the source. Carter muttered a curse, pulling his knife out, while Mason and Riley readied their weapons. In the distance, shadows began to move, figures stumbling and lurching toward them from behind the barricade. It was a horde, dozens of decayed, hollow-eyed zombies, their bodies twisted and broken yet driven by an insatiable hunger. "Back in the van. Now!" Mason shouted. They bolted for the vehicle, Carter starting the engine as the zombies closed in. The van roared to life, wheels spinning as they reversed, skidding around obstacles. But one of the undead latched onto the side, clawing at Riley through the window. "Hold on!" Carter yelled, jerking the wheel to shake it off. The zombie flew back, landing in a pile of rubble as they sped away. Once they'd put enough distance between themselves and the horde, Carter slowed down, breathing heavily. Riley's hands were shaking, and Mason reached out to steady her. "That was close," Mason said, glancing at Carter. "You sure you don't want to reconsider the detour?" Carter sneered. "I don't back down from anything. We just need a new plan." As they continued south, the road became rougher, the landscape gradually shifting into rural terrain with dense forests on either side. They decided to find shelter before nightfall, turning off the main road and following a narrow path that led them to an old farmhouse. The place looked abandoned, windows shattered, the roof sagging. They parked the van nearby, cautiously approaching the house with their weapons drawn. Mason pushed open the door, and they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, with dust covering every surface and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. But it offered more protection than the open road, and for that, they were grateful. As darkness fell, they gathered in the living room, lighting a small fire in the fireplace. Carter sat across from them, sharpening his knife in silence. Mason and Riley shared a can of beans, eating slowly, savoring each bite. After a long silence, Riley spoke up. "Carter, do you think there's really a place for survivors? Somewhere safe?" Carter didn't look up. "Maybe. Or maybe we're just kidding ourselves. But what if we don't find it?" Riley asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mason put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We will. We just have to keep going." The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across their faces. In that dim light, they could almost pretend they were safe, that the world outside wasn't filled with nightmares. But the silence was shattered by a noise, a faint creak from upstairs. They froze, every muscle tensing. Carter held up a finger to his lips, motioning for them to stay quiet. Slowly, he stood, moving toward the staircase with Mason close behind. They crept up the stairs, the floorboards creaking beneath them, each step feeling like a lifetime. At the top, the hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors that led to empty rooms. But one door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out. Carter nudged the door open with his knife, and they peered inside. The room was empty, save for a single rocking chair that swayed gently, as if someone had just been sitting there. But the chair was empty. They shared a look, the unspoken understanding that something was deeply wrong in this house. Carter reached for the door, slowly closing it, and they retreated back downstairs, every instinct screaming to leave. As they settled back around the fire, no one spoke. They didn't have to, each of them knew the danger was far from over. They would face many more horrors on the road south, and the shadows would follow them every step of the way. But for tonight, they had each other, and that was the only comfort they could afford.